themselves with their faces to the ground upon the pavement and worshiped and praised the Lord, for he is good, and for his mercy endureth forever. Now, we'll give you a little background. This episode we have here happened 900 and some years before Christ. And you'll recall that the second king of Israel was King David. He ruled for 40 years after the 40-year rule of King Saul, and David ruled about 1,000 years before Christ. And one day he had just finished a beautiful mansion for himself, and he was looking out the window, and he noticed the little tent in which was kept the Ark of the Covenant. Now, you'll remember that the Ark of the Covenant represented the presence of God. Some 400 years previously, it had been kept in the holiest place of all, inside of the tabernacle in the wilderness. And after they came across the river Jordan, the children of Israel, and occupied the land of Canaan, of course, the tabernacle was no longer used. They never did bring it across the river, but they did bring the Ark of the Covenant. You remember inside of this ark, there were those items, the tables of stone, or the stones upon which the Ten Commandments had been written. And then while they were in the wilderness, also there was the rod that budded, the rod of Aaron that budded, and also the golden pot of manna. All of these speaking of different aspects of the person and ministry of the Lord Jesus Christ, looking forward to him and his ministry. And so then over the top of this little chest of wood that was completely overlaid with gold, there was two replica of cherubim, and then there was what was known as the mercy seat, on which the blood of the sacrifices was was sprinkled. And inside of this holiest place, when the Ark of the Covenant was in the tabernacle, inside of this holy place, there always glowed a brilliant light called the Shekinah glory, and it glowed up over the mercy seat between the two cherubim. And this represented for them the presence of God. Of course, it was only seen once a year. It was seen originally, of course, when God accepted the tabernacle it was built. You can read that in the last chapter, the 40th chapter, that is, of Exodus, how God manifested his presence there at the Ark of the Covenant. And then this Shekinah glory, this brilliant light that represented the presence of God, was only seen once a year, and it was seen then only by the high priest. So David was looking out of his window in this magnificent palace that he built through the help of Hiram, the king of Tyre, and he said that it was a pity that he had such a luxurious place to live, and the presence of God, the place that was used to commemorate God's presence, was in just a little tent. And so he wanted to build the most ornate building that had ever been made in all the world. Now, you could find this story in the 7th chapter of 2 Samuel. And so he told it to Nathan the priest, or to Nathan the prophet. And Nathan says, well, that's great, go ahead and do it. And then the Lord came to Nathan and said, look, I didn't tell you to tell David that. And he said, you tell David this, that I don't need a place to live, that all the heavens are mine, and the earth is mine, and that I never ask for some earthly palace to live in. But I understand he has good motives, so you tell him it'll be all right if he wants to gather the material, and I'll let his son Solomon build an ornate building in which he can place the Ark of the Covenant, and in which I'll make my presence known to the children of Israel. So you'll recall how David spent all of his latter years as king gathering together all of this material. And then Solomon, in the early part of his reign, had this great temple erected in Jerusalem, near the site now, or some say on the site, and some say near the site of the Dome of the Rock, the mosque that you can see if you go to Jerusalem at the present time. Now, this was the place where God said he was to be worshipped by the children of Israel. He told them before they ever came, told Joshua that this was the place. And this is where, of course, Abraham had offered up Isaac in sacrifice, and it's where David had made his sacrifices unto the Lord. So Solomon built this building, which is probably the most expensive building that's ever been built on this earth. It was all overlaid with gold, all the entire inside. And there's been various estimates of the millions and millions of dollars that it would be worth if it were here today. It had all types of precious stones in it, and was made of whatever was the most ornate and most luxurious. And so here we have in this story, those of you who came in a little later, we've just read from 2 Chronicles chapter 7, the first 3 verses. Here you have the acceptance of the building. They had just moved the Ark of the Covenant inside. That would be in chapter 5 of 2 Chronicles. And here you have the acceptance of this building by God as a place where he will manifest his presence. And then he makes some conditions to Solomon. Notice in verse 12. Well, let's start with verse 11 of 2 Chronicles 7. Thus Solomon finished the house of the Lord and the king's house and all that came into Solomon's heart to make in the house of the Lord, and in his own house he prosperously effected. And the Lord appeared to Solomon by night, and said unto him, I have heard thy prayer, and have chosen this place for myself as a house of sacrifice. And then he goes on to tell them that he'll meet them there. But notice he gives a warning. He says in verse 19, But if you turn away and forsake my statutes and my commandments, which I have set before you, and shall go and serve other gods and worship them, then will I pluck them up by the roots out of my land, which I have given them, and this house, which I have sanctified for my name, will I cast out of my sight, and will make it to be a proverb and a byword among all nations. And this house, which is high, shall be an astonishment to every one that passes by, so that he shall say, Why hath the Lord done thus unto the land and unto this house? So no sooner had God occupied with his presence this ornate temple than he said, If you don't obey my commandments, this house will simply be a mockery, and I'll have it torn down brick by brick. And so that it won't be here anymore, because my name is holy, and it must represent holiness in the presence of my people. Well, you could read the account, the historical account from the Bible here, and you'd find that God's people turned away from him. And you'll remember when we were studying earlier in the book of Ezekiel, how Ezekiel portrayed the fact in pantomime that the northern 10 tribes had gone into idolatry 390 years previously, and or no sooner than the temple was built here, just about, and then the southern kingdom had gone into idolatry for some 40 years previous to the time that we have in Ezekiel. Now let's turn to the book of Ezekiel, chapter 10. And our setting here is almost 400 years later. The episode we're reading about here happened almost 400 years after the acceptance of the temple on the part of God. And God had sent prophet after prophet to tell the children of Israel if they didn't turn from their idolatry, that he would have to destroy the temple and dispossess them from their land. And their leaders said, look, the thing's been here almost 400 years. God's not going to do away with his own temple. And every time God would raise up a prophet, well, the false prophets would poo-poo him and and sometimes even kill him, because they said that he was bringing them bad news. So we find that this is the atmosphere in which Ezekiel came. And God, of course, told Ezekiel that you tell them that now's the time. They've not obeyed me, and although this beautiful place has been here almost 400 years, I'm going to have it done away with. And we come to this setting in chapter 10 of Ezekiel. Notice verse 4. Then the glory of the Lord went up from the cherub, that is, there in the holy place, see, and stood over the threshold of the house, and the house was filled with the cloud, and the court was full of the brightness of the Lord's glory. So you see, the glory of the Lord should be back there in the holiest place. Well, he's leaving that and going to the threshold of the temple, the entranceway of the temple. So much as to say, now I said that I was going to leave from being among you if you didn't quit your disobedient practices. And so can't you see, I'm carrying out my word. But he waited there, and you'll see some more words that we had here last week. Then notice in verse 18 of chapter 10, then the glory of the Lord departed from off the threshold of the house and stood over the cherubim, and the cherubim lifted up their wings and mounted up from the earth in my sight, and they went out. The wheels also were beside them, and every one stood at the door of the east gate of the Lord's house, and the glory of the Lord of the God of Israel was over above them. So now you see the presence of the Lord, this brilliance that came from the temple, has left the threshold and gone out to the east gate of the temple area. It's God reluctantly leaving the place that represents the fact that he is among his people and leading them and guiding them and offering to be there in his presence. But they still didn't heed that, so we get on over into the 11th chapter, verse 23. And the glory of the Lord went up from the midst of the city and stood upon the mountain which is on the east side of the city. Now, let's just draw this picture again. Jerusalem sets up on a series of hills about 2,500 feet above sea level. And if you were to walk out of the temple in those times, towards the east, you'd come to what was known as the Golden Gate or the Great Eastern Gate, which is today, of course, all sealed up. And if you went outside that eastern gate, you would have gone down a steep decline to a little brook called the Brook Kidron, which means the Brook of the Cedars. And if you crossed over that little brook, then continue westward, you'd be going right up the ascent of the Mount of Olives, alongside the Garden of Gethsemane, and on up to the top of the Mount of Olives. And you would reach an elevation about 200 or so feet higher than the temple site in Jerusalem. That is to say, if you would turn around and face westward and look over this valley of Kidron, you could see the whole city of Jerusalem spread out before you, because you would be on a hill just to the east of Jerusalem, which would be some 200 feet higher than the crest of the group of hills on which Jerusalem was built. So you could look down upon the city. So what the presence of the Lord did here was to leave the temple, go towards the east, and rest upon the top of that mountain on the Mount of Olives. Well, Isaiah had already prophesied 100 and some years previously, in Isaiah chapter 60, for instance, that when God came to set up his righteous rule on the earth, that he would come from the east, that he would come from the Mount of Olives on the east, and would be as the rising of the sun, ushering in a bright new day. So you see, God is leaving Israel. Now this marks that which we call, that which Jesus called in the book of Luke, the times of the Gentiles. Marks the beginning of it. That is to say, God is now not going to do his work through Israel as a nation on this earth anymore. He had been doing that for several hundred years. And he promises them all through this book of Ezekiel that one day, again, he's going to do his work on earth through that nation, as a nation. But he's ceasing because they will not yield to his direction. So we have the glory of the Lord reluctantly departing from the temple after 400 years of patient endurance and pleading and the sending of prophets, all of these times. Now, you notice that before God, or as soon as God built the temple, he said that under circumstances it would be destroyed. And of course, the story of its complete destruction is found several places in the Bible. For instance, the last chapter in the book of 2 Kings, that's 2 Kings chapter 25, in Jeremiah chapter 39, and again Jeremiah chapter 52. The story of the utter desecration of this temple is described for us. But just as he predicted its destruction before it was ever destroyed, he predicted that another temple would be built on that site. Now, this was in by the prophet Isaiah. And if you want to turn there, it's in Isaiah chapter 44. Isaiah 44, verse 28. And Isaiah's making this prophecy almost 200 years before it came about. And he says, "Who saith of Cyrus," that would be a future king of Persia, "He is my shepherd, and shall perform all my pleasure, even saying to Jerusalem, Thou shalt be built, and to the temple thy foundations shall be laid." Now, if we had time, we could go back over into the book of Ezra, and we would find that when Cyrus was king of Persia, that he made a decree and said that the temple should be rebuilt in Jerusalem. And you'll remember that Ezra took a delegation of Jews over there, and they rebuilt the temple, sort of in two stages. You can get the first stage of it is in chapter 3 of Ezra, and you may recall that he brought some of the very, very old men. Now, this was about 70 years after the other one had been torn down. And he brought some of the very, very old men and told them to look at the foundation and compare it with the other one. And the old men wept bitterly because they said it was just nothing compared to the old one. It was nowhere near as ornate or as large and so forth, and they were very disappointed in it. But anyway, the completion of that temple is described for you in Ezra chapter 6, and it's often referred to as Ezra's temple. And sometimes it's referred to as Zerubbabel's temple, because Zerubbabel was the governor in charge at the time that the temple was built. Now, some people get this confused with Nehemiah. Nehemiah didn't rebuild the temple. Nehemiah supervised the construction of the walls of the city of Jerusalem some decades after the temple had been rebuilt. So you have the rebuilding of the temple in Ezra and the rebuilding of the walls of Jerusalem around the temple area in the book of Nehemiah. Now, we said that Isaiah prophesied the rebuilding. It's interesting to note that he prophesied the rebuilding before the first one was ever destroyed. And it remained destroyed for some 70 years. Then this other one was brought about. You get much of the details of the time of the rebuilding of this temple in two prophets, because God raised up two prophets for that time. Every time the people would get disheartened, he'd get these two prophets to preach to the people and encourage them and get them to go ahead with the work. And these two prophets were the prophet Haggai and the prophet Zechariah. That's the third to the last and the second to the last prophets in the Old Testament. And I think we ought to turn there now. If you don't know how to find it, well, find Matthew and go backwards 3 books, and that'll be Haggai. All right. Haggai, I guess, is the way to pronounce it. Can you find it now? Haggai? Haggai. Third from the last book in the Old Testament. Haggai chapter 1. Haggai. In the 2nd year of Darius the king, in the 6th month, in the 1st day of the month, came the word of the Lord by Haggai the prophet unto Zerubbabel the son of Shealtiel, governor of Judah, and to Joshua the son of Jehozadak, the high priest, saying, Thus speaketh the Lord of hosts, saying, This people say, the time is not come, the time that the Lord's house should be built. Then came the word of the Lord to Haggai the prophet, saying, It is time for you, O ye, to dwell in your sealed houses, and this house lie waste. In other words, that's using sarcasm, see. And so Haggai goes on and tells them to get busy and build the temple. Now look over in the 2nd chapter, verse 1. In the 7th month, in the 120th day of the month, the word of the Lord by the prophet Haggai, saying, Speak now to Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, governor of Judah, and to Joshua, the son of Jehozadak, the high priest, and to the residue of the people, saying, Who is left among you that saw this house in its first glory? And how do you see it now? Is it not in your eyes in comparison with it as nothing? Well, this is only confirming what we had back over in Ezra chapter 3, where the old men wept because this temple was nothing to compare to the other one. But now, read on, for instance, in verse 6 of chapter 2. For thus saith the Lord of hosts, Yet once, it is a little while, and I shall shake the heavens, and the earth, and the sea, and the dry land, and I will shake all nations, and the desire of all nations shall come, and I will fill the house with glory, saith the Lord of hosts. And the silver is mine, the gold is mine, saith the Lord of hosts. The glory of this latter house shall be greater than the former, saith the Lord of hosts. And in this place will I give peace, saith the Lord of hosts. Now here's a strange thing. The old men say, no, this is nothing compared with the other one. And yet the prophet says that the glory is going to be greater. Now notice another thing he says. You remember how the glory of the Lord came into the house, into the Solomon's temple, and then left 300 and some years later? Well, you can read all about the construction of Ezra's temple, and you'll never see it said that the glory of the Lord came back into the temple. And yet here it says that, verse 7, and I will fill this house with glory, saith the Lord, and that the glory of this latter house shall be greater. What's the answer to that? Well, the answer is that Haggai is using this occasion to prophesy that sometime in the future there's going to be a temple on that same site which will surpass by an incomparable degree the temple that Solomon built. And we can know when this is because it says, first he's got to shake all nations. Now, this is the terminology that's used in the Old Testament, one of the terminologies that's used to describe the Great Tribulation, the time of Jacob's trouble, that 3.5-year period of time that's still yet future now. Haggai is talking about a time that's still future to us. Now, he was prophesying 500 years before Christ. He was speaking at a time 2,500 years ago, and he was talking about something that's still future now. And we know this is because he says it's going to happen after God shakes all the nations, and the desire of all nations shall come. Now, who is the desire of all nations? This is the coming Messiah that he's speaking of. This is a term that's used. It's used also in Daniel to describe the coming Messiah. So it has to be after the desire of all nations shall come, and it has to be, look in the last phrase again in verse 9, and in this place will I give peace, saith the Lord of hosts. You see, Jerusalem means the city of peace, and Christ the King of peace one day will rule there. So we know from this prophecy in Haggai that there's still going to be another temple there. Now watch this. We said that the Bible lesson today is going to be called the 7 temples of God. The 7 temples of God. Now we've already identified 3, haven't we? Number 1, the one that Solomon built some 900 and some years before Christ. Number 2, the one that Ezra built some 500 years before Christ. And number 3, one that's still future, one that's going to be in glory far superior to Solomon's temple on that same site, on that same place. Well, now, instead of calling that number 3, we're going to call it number 7, because there must be 4 other interim temples before we get to that one, as we'll see. So, temple number 1 is historical. It was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar 600 years before Christ. Temple number 2 is historical. It was destroyed during the intertestament period, some 200 and some years before Christ, during the time of Antiochus Epiphanes and those, before Christ ever came between this and that. Now, this next prophet, Zechariah, also prophesied about this temple number 7, the one that's going to be glorious, the one that's still future. Look in Zechariah chapter 1, verse 16. Therefore, thus saith the Lord, I am returned to Jerusalem with mercies. My house shall be built in it, saith the Lord of hosts, and a line shall be stretched forth upon Jerusalem, or that is, Jerusalem shall be rebuilt too. Now, God says this in answer to a complaint on the part of Israel that it's been 70 years since the old temple was destroyed, and where's the temple? God says, well, there's going to be another temple here. Well, this prophecy of Zechariah has a double sight. It sees something that's going to be soon, that's Ezra's temple, and it also sees something that's going to be distant. How do we know that? Because in chapter 2, verse 8, for thus saith the Lord of hosts, after the glory hath he sent me unto the nations which spoiled you, for he that toucheth you toucheth the apple of my eye. For behold, I will shake mine hand upon them. Here we have this again, you see. He's talking about something that's still future. And this is brought out even more clearly over in chapter 6 of Zechariah, verse 12. And speak unto him, saying, thus speaketh the Lord of hosts, saying, behold the man whose name is the branch. Notice that phrase, the branch, is all in capitals. This is one of the names of Christ in the Old Testament. We could have a whole Bible study on that. But he's the man, the branch. And he shall grow up out of his place, and he shall build the temple of the Lord. Who shall build the temple of the Lord? The branch. Even he shall build the temple of the Lord, and he shall bear the glory, and shall sit and rule upon his throne, and he shall be a priest upon his throne, and the counsel of peace shall be between them both. Now, You understand, don't you, that when Jesus Christ came to this earth some 2,000 years ago, he came as a prophet. That is to say, he came as a man to speak to men for God. Today, he's a priest because he's a man who's in the heavens to speak to God for men. But this priest is the one that one day is going to be on the throne. Now, this is a very strange thing because in the Old Testament economy, a priest was never permitted to be a king, and a king was never permitted to be a priest. But Zechariah is saying the time's going to come when the priest is going to sit upon the king's throne. Well, he's the priest now, and he's going to come as the king. He's our great heavenly high priest today. He intercedes. He's our advocate, our intercessor, our intermediary. And Zechariah said, before he ever came the first time, Zechariah said he's going to come, he's going to leave his priestly office and come sit on the throne. It'll be a priest upon a throne, and he's going to build the temple. So who's going to build the temple number 7? It's going to be Christ himself. Now let's say a few words about temple number 4. This temple number 3. Temple number 2, which was Ezra's temple, was destroyed some 150 years or so before Christ. And then there was a usurper by the name of Herod, who went to see the emperor, the Roman emperor in Rome, some years before Christ was born, and convinced Caesar that he would be the one to rule over Israel, the province of Israel. Israel was under Roman domination at the time. And he got Caesar's permission to attempt to build this great future temple. Now you say, well, how would he know how to build it? Well, we're going to see before the night's over that the Bible carries very, very intricate, detailed, descriptive material concerning this last temple that Christ is going to build. The one, remember, that Haggai said would far surpass the glory of the first, and that would come after the shaking of the nations, and the one that Zechariah said would be built by the man, the branch, and the one that would bring peace, the priest that should come and sit on the throne. Now, Herod attempted to build that temple, and that was the temple that was here when Christ was born. Remember, there was an elderly lady named Anna that used to go, this story is in the book of Luke, first chapter. She used to go into the temple. There was a temple there, and she used to go into the temple and pray that the Messiah would come. And then when Christ was a little baby and was being taken to the temple for his dedication, there was an old man named Simon there, and he had asked God that he could live until he could see the Messiah. And he saw him there as a little child, a little baby, there in the temple. This story is also there in the book of Luke. So there was a temple, wasn't there? And then we read all through the Gospels about Jesus went and taught in the temple, and he ran the money changers out of the temple, and so forth. There was a temple there. Well, this was built under the direction of King Herod. But while Christ was still here, he told the disciples that that temple would be destroyed. They asked him a question. It's in Matthew chapter 24. Now we're talking about temple number 3, aren't we? Generally described as Herod's temple. I'm going to run out of time before I'm going to run out of temples, I'll tell you that. Matthew chapter 24, verse 1, and Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and his disciples came to him to show him the buildings of the temple, and Jesus said to them, see ye not all these things? Verily I say unto you, there shall not be left here one stone after another that shall not be thrown down. Now, not only did he prophesy the destruction of this temple, and it came about 40 years after Christ was crucified at the hands of the Roman Titus. There was a rebellion on the part of the Israelites, and he came and destroyed the temple and took the temple apart stone by stone in answer to this prophecy that Christ made. But not only did Jesus prophesy, not only did he prophesy the destruction of temple number 3, but he also prophesied the rebuilding of temple number 6. Now, not number 7, but number 6, which is also still future. Now, he did this in the same 24th chapter. Verse 15. When ye therefore shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the Daniel the prophet stand in the holy place, whosoever readeth, let him understand. Now the holy place would have to be in the temple. And here's what Jesus is referring to. Twice in the book of Daniel, once in the 9th chapter and once in the 12th chapter, Daniel says that there's going to be a covenant between a world ruler and the nation of Israel. And this world ruler is going to permit Israel to rebuild their temple and start their worship again. And Daniel says they're going to have a daily sacrifice, just like they used to have in the past, in this temple. And there's going to be a covenant that will last 7 years. And right in the midst of the 7 years, at the end of 3.5 years, that this world ruler will break the covenant with Israel and will set up an idol of himself in the holy place in the temple. And he calls it an abomination of desolation, or an abomination that maketh desolate. And so Jesus says to the Jews here in chapter 24, he says, when you see this abomination of desolation, this idol that was spoken of by the prophet Daniel in Daniel chapter 9 and in Daniel chapter 12, when you see it, you better head for the hills, because terrible times are coming. This will be the key that will tell the beginning of the Great Tribulation. You see, the 7-year tribulation period is divided into 2 parts, right in the middle. The first half is generally termed the tribulation, and the last half the Great Tribulation. So he says, you'll know that the Great Tribulation is starting when you see that idol set up in that temple. So you see, in the first part of this chapter, Jesus says the temple that's there now is going to be destroyed, and there's going to be another one there. There's got to be another one there, just like Daniel said. Now, we've skipped temples number 4 and 5, haven't we? We did that on purpose, because Jesus prophesied number 6 at the time that he prophesied the destruction of number 3. And so we're going to skip 4 and 5. This temple number 6, which is going to be built in the future, it's not there yet, never has been yet, but it's mentioned many times in the Bible. Twice in Daniel, once in Matthew, once in Mark, once in 2 Thessalonians. Let's go there and find it. We can't look up all the scriptures, but let's go to 2 Thessalonians. Comes right after 1 Thessalonians. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. Verse 3, let no man deceive you by any means, for that day, that means when Christ comes back to set up his kingdom, for that day shall not come except there come a falling away first, and man of sin be revealed, the son of perdition. This is that same world ruler that Daniel spoke about. Verse 4, who opposes and exalts himself above all that is called God, or that is worshipped, so that he as God sits in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. Paul is referring to the same abomination of desolation, the same idol that Jesus was referring to in Matthew chapter 24, and that Daniel referred to in Daniel chapter 9 and in Daniel chapter 12. Now, this temple here is also mentioned in Revelation chapter 11 and in Revelation chapter 13. Let's look for a moment at Revelation chapter 11. Verse 1, and there was given me a reed like a rod, and the angel stood saying, rise and measure the temple of God, and the altar, and them that worship in it. But the court which is without the temple leave out, and measure it not, for it is given unto the Gentiles, and the holy city shall be tread underfoot 42 months. This same 3.5-year period that Daniel spoke about and that Jesus talked about in Matthew chapter 24. He says, right in the middle of that 7-year period. See, we're talking about the same time exactly, right when that covenant between the world ruler and the Jewish nation is broken, and the world ruler sets up his statue, his idol, as an item of worship, and says to the Jews, you can't worship your God here anymore, you got to worship me. This is what this is talking about. Of course, this is the ministry of the 2 witnesses that shall prophesy for 3.5 years, that time of Jacob's trouble. Then over in Revelation chapter 13, verse 11, and I beheld another beast coming out of the earth, and he had 2 horns like a lamb, but he spoke like a dragon. That means people took him to be Christ, but he's really the devil. And he exercises all the power of the first beast before him, and causes the earth and them that, who dwell on it to worship the first beast whose deadly wound was healed. And he does great wonders, and he makes so that he makes fire come down from heaven on the earth in the sight of men, and deceives them that dwell on the earth by the means of those miracles which he had the power to do in the sight of the beast, saying to them that dwell on the earth that they should make an image to the beast that had the wound by a sword and did leave. And he had power to give life unto the image of the beast, that the image of the beast should both speak and cause that as many as would not worship the image of the beast should be killed. All right, let's review what we have now in the way of temples. Number one, built by Solomon 900 and some years before Christ, destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar about 600 years before Christ. Temple number two on the same site, built under the direction of Ezra 500 and some years before Christ, and destroyed by the invading armies in the intertestament time about 150 or 200 years before Christ. Temple number three, built by King Herod and destroyed by the Roman general under Titus. Destroyed 70 A.D. There's three. Okay, number six is still future. It's to be built during the first half of the tribulation, just after the rapture of the saints. I'm sorry, you won't be around. I suppose it could be built or started while you're still here, but the chances are it won't, because God won't bring about his Jewish economy, so to speak, until the church is taken out. So you probably won't be able to see it. But it's going to be right soon. And it's going to be built very quickly, because within 3.5 years after the rapture, it's going to be in full operation in Jerusalem. And that one is going to be destroyed at the Battle of Armageddon. It's not going to be around very long. That one's still future. And remember, that one, you could call that the Tribulation Temple, or the temple, the Antichrist Temple. And it's prophesied 2 places in Daniel, Matthew, Mark, 2 Thessalonians, and 2 places in Revelation. That ought to be enough, hadn't it? So that we know that the Bible says it's going to be. That's number 6. Number 7 was prophesied by Haggai, that's the one with all the glory, and by Zechariah. It's also prophesied by Ezekiel, and we'll see when we get to it. Now, how about temple number 4? All right, go back to John, the Gospel of John, chapter 2, and we'll find temple number 4. John chapter 2, verse 18. This was at the very beginning of the earthly ministry of Jesus Christ. Then answered the Jews and said unto him, What sign showest thou unto us, seeing that thou dost these things? Jesus answered and said unto them, Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. Then said the Jews, 46 years was this temple in building, and thou wilt raise it up in 3 days? But he spoke of the temple of his body. Now, what is a temple? A temple is a place from which God emanates or shows forth his glory. He puts himself on display. The word glory means excellence on display, or excellence manifested. And so the temple of God is that place from which he shows his glory. Now, he never did that. From Ezra's temple, the sacrifices went on there, but he never displayed his glory from that temple, although he accepted it as a place of worship. Because, you see, when he displays his glory from it, he says, I am doing my work in this world from this place, and I am showing myself forth from here. And so the real temple, when Herod's temple was on earth, was the body of Jesus Christ. That's where God's glory was manifested. Now, you can see this. Notice back in John chapter 1, verse 14, And the Word was made flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory, the glory as the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. This is where the glory of God shone forth. Let's look on over in John chapter 17. Verse 4. Jesus speaking to the Father. I have glorified thee on earth. I have finished the work which thou gavest to me, and now, O Father, glorify thou me with thine own self, and so forth. He was the glory of God manifested, or shown forth. He was the real temple when he was here on earth. So that's temple number 4, okay? We only got one to go, right? 5. Temple number 5. Let's find it. Ephesians chapter 2. My, I'm running you around something awful, but I don't know how to do it any other way. Ephesians. That comes right after Galatians. Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians. General Electric, Pepsi-Cola. Ephesians chapter 2. Verse 19. Now therefore, ye are no more strangers and sojourners or foreigners, but fellow citizens with the saints and of the household of God. Now watch it. He's talking about the church, everybody that's saved, and are built upon the foundation of the apostles and prophets, Jesus Christ himself being the chief cornerstone, in whom all the building fitly framed together groweth unto a holy temple in the Lord, in whom ye also are built together for a habitation of God through the Spirit. That's what David said he was doing. He was building a habitation for God. That's what the temple was. Where is the habitation of God today? It's in the beings of all the saved people from the day of Pentecost until the rapture of the church. Now, the temple of God today has 2 aspects. Now, that's why there's no building over there in Jerusalem. God has a temple. He has a place from which his excellence shows forth on earth. But it's not on that mountain in Jerusalem. It's this building here that's built up on the foundation of the apostles, the prophets and the apostles. Now this has 2 aspects. Aspect number 1, all the Christians that have ever been born into the family of God from the day of Pentecost until the rapture of the church make up the building blocks which make a great temple unto God. It lasts for 2,000 years. That's one aspect. Aspect number 2, the body of each Christian is a separate temple. You see, his temple today is Mobile. He's ahead of his time, isn't he? And he gets around from one place to the other. It isn't in just one location. Remember when Jesus says, the time shall be and now is, when they that worship God shall neither worship him in Jerusalem or on this mountain, but they shall worship him in spirit and in truth, not in a particular place. Back to 2 Corinthians. 2 books backwards. Or 2 books forward. Anyway, it's 2 books back towards the front. 2 Corinthians, chapter 6. Here we have it again. Verse 16. And what agreement hath the temple of God with idols? For ye, all of you together, are the temple. For all of you together are, plural, one temple. You are the temple of the living God. As God hath said, I will dwell in them and walk in them, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. Wherefore, since this is true, come out from among them, that is those of the world, and be ye separate, saith the Lord, and touch not the unclean thing, and I will receive you, and I will be a father unto you, and you shall be my sons and daughters, saith the Lord Almighty. He's saying, since I've made you my temple, my place of abode in the world at this time, you need to be different. You're the place from where God shows forth. Now, in 1 Corinthians, we have the other aspect, the individual body, and it'll be easy to see this. Chapter 6 of 1 Corinthians. I hope nobody's got their roast on or something. I'm going to get burnt. Now, you can see that this is speaking of individual Christians. 1 Corinthians 6:18. Flee fornication. Each one of you, that is. Every sin that a man doeth is without the body, but he that committeth fornication sinneth against his own body. This is why a Christian does not involve himself in sexual promiscuity, because God says your body is for another purpose. Now, when you get married, you're one flesh, so that's different. But this is a reason that, you've got something to do. You're showing forth something. Look in verse 19. What? Know ye not that your body your individual body, is the temple of the Holy Ghost, who is in you, whom ye have of God, and ye are not your own, for ye were bought with a price. Therefore, do what? Glorify, show forth the excellence, manifest God in your body and in your spirit, which are God's. God's place to show forth himself, to manifest himself, and manifest his glory. That's why we have in another place in 1 Corinthians in chapter 10, it says, whatsoever ye do in word and deed, do all to the glory of God, realizing every moment of every day that this is God's temple, and he manifests his excellence on earth today from this place. Now, the other mention to this fifth temple of God, by the way, in the Bible, when the word 5 is used figuratively, it means grace. And certainly, it's only by the grace of God that he would use such a one for a temple, that he would put his temple in an earthen vessel. 1 Corinthians chapter 3. Now, if you have a Scofield Bible and you read your notes here, Scofield thinks that this temple we find in chapter 3 is the corporate church. But I think I can show you that it's the individual Christian body, just like chapter 6 is. This fifth temple is mentioned 4 times very specifically in the Bible. Twice in 1 Corinthians, where it refers to the individual Christian, the body of the individual Christian, once in 2 Corinthians, and once in Ephesians, which 2 places it's describing the overall church. You see, if we're in chapter 3 of 1 Corinthians, if we start looking in the 11th verse, for other foundations can no man lay than that which is laid, which is Christ Jesus. Now, if any man, in any individual man, any one man, build upon the foundation, gold, silver, and precious stone, wood, hay, and stubble, every man's, or this could be translated, each man's work, shall be made manifest, for the day shall declare it. In Greek, each and every is the same word. Because it shall be revealed by fire, and the fire shall try every or each man's work of what sort it is. And if any man's work abide, which he hath built upon it, he shall receive reward. And if any man's work shall be burned, he's talking about each one of you individually, he shall suffer loss, but he himself shall be saved, yet as by fire. Know ye not that ye are the temple of God, and that the Spirit of God dwelleth in you? Now let me ask you something before we read any further. When God had this first temple in Jerusalem, was there a circumstance upon which he would no longer permit that building to be his temple? Yes, if it was continuously desecrated. He says, I'll wipe it out from before my face. I won't let it be my temple anymore. All right? Is there a circumstance upon which God will cease to let this body be his temple? Let's see. Verse 17. If any man, if any individual Christian, that is, defile the temple of God, him shall God destroy. And for the temple of God is holy, which temple you are. Now God has in mind the same thing that happened to Solomon's temple. Solomon's temple, the use of it was perverted. Those of you here last week saw all the ways it was being perverted, didn't you? How it was being desecrated and misused. And God said, because of that, I cannot let this represent my presence in this world anymore. And the time can come when the temple that he uses today, that is your body, he will not use it anymore. That is to say, if you don't yield your body after he prompts you, and you will not yield your body for him to show forth his excellence, it's the only place from which he shows forth his excellence. And if you refuse to yield it to him and you use it for your own temple, that is to say, you show forth your own excellence there, or do what you want to, instead of yielding it to God's use, then the time will come when he will take away his Shekinah glory from out of your temple, and he will not use it again. This is what Paul meant when he said in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, he says, I stay under my body, lest after I've run the race, I should become a castaway or be disallowed in the race. And of course, this is what Paul's talking about back in the Timothy letters, both of them, when he's speaking about those who've made shipwreck of the faith. That he says he's turned some over to Satan for the destruction of the body, that the spirit may be saved in that day. Now it says here that the temple shall be destroyed, but yet it says that they shall be saved as though by fire. Does it mean when a temple of God is no longer acceptable as His place for showing forth His glory? Does it mean that that individual then forfeits his right to heaven? Well, let's carry the analogy all the way through. Let's go back to Ezekiel again. Let's go to Ezekiel chapter 43. You remember in Ezekiel chapter 11, we saw the glory of God departing from the temple there in Jerusalem, didn't we? All right, let's look at, and where did the glory of God go when it left the temple? It went to the Mount of Olives on the east, didn't it? All right, let's look in Ezekiel chapter 43. Now let me explain something to you before we look here. In chapters 40, 41, and 42, you have a detailed description of that temple that's going to be, the one that Herod tried to imitate. The temple that Jesus is going to build, the man, the branch, the priest upon his throne, the one He's going to build in the future. That's the second one future from now. The one He's going to build. You have all of the detailed descriptions of the building of that temple in those chapters in Ezekiel. We'll get to that, and we'll talk about it some more when we get there in our study of Ezekiel. But I want you to look now at Ezekiel chapter 43. Afterward He brought me to the gate, even the gate that looketh towards the east. And behold, the glory of the God of Israel came from the way of the east. Now, why did it come from that way? Because that's where it departed to, wasn't it? And His voice was like the voice of many waters, and the earth shined with His glory. And it was according to the appearance of the vision which I saw, even according to the vision that I saw when I came to destroy the city. That is, that we were talking about earlier in our study of Ezekiel. And the visions were like the visions that I saw by the river Kibar, and I fell upon my face. Verse 4. And the glory of the Lord came into the house by the way of the gate whose prospect is towards the east. So the Spirit took me up and brought me into the inner court, and behold, the glory of the Lord filled the house. Now, as far as the literal physical building is concerned, the presence, the Shekinah glory, that great glowing light, left 600 years before Christ because of the sinfulness of the people, and that glory is not going to come back to a literal building until Jesus comes and builds the temple during the millennium. That's still future. And the glory is going to come from the east, just like it departed to the east. Now I ask you again, in Solomon's temple, was there a circumstance under which God would not permit that temple to be used anymore for His glory? Yes, there was. And we saw it. And He gave the warning of it to start with. Before He ever, when He occupied the temple, He gave the warning. Now, did God depart that temple forever? That particular physical structure He did, but not that place. Because His glory is going to come back. Even though it was misused, His glory is going to come back to that same spot again in the future. And it's going to be more glorious than ever, according to the prophet Haggai. Well, the whole message of the New Testament is this. At this day and time, God privileges you to be the temple of the living God, that place from which He shows forth His excellence. And if you will not yield this body to show forth that excellence of God, if you will continually vent your temper when people don't treat you just right, that is, you're standing on your own rights, and when you will satisfy your pleasures, and when you give more regard to how you fare in this world than how God fares in showing forth His glory from your body, the time will come when God will say, I will not put up with this anymore. I'll leave. I'll destroy this temple. But remember, that's a temple of grace. And one day, the glory of God will enter into that same temple again, more glorious than ever, even though it was once destroyed, just like Solomon's temple, see. When God called you to Himself, it did not depend upon your faithfulness as a temple of God, whether or not one day you would fulfill His purposes. It's up to you whether or not you will fulfill His purposes or not in this life. But you've been sealed by the Spirit of God. And one day, even though you desecrate the temple now, as Israel desecrated the temple back then. One day, the glory of God will show forth. And this is the wonderful grace of God. Do you see it? You quite get it there? Well, it's a lot of truth, and it's a deep truth, and it's much more than we ought to try to do in one night. And usually I would take at least 3 Bible studies to teach a series on the temple of God. But that's just incidental to this series. We're teaching the book of Ezekiel, and we'll be beginning with the 11th chapter again next week. But while we're in this part here, in these chapters 10 and 11, where we see the glory of God departing to the east, I thought it appropriate that we go through this whole theme of the temple of God and give us discharge of the fact that we're not our own. We're bought with a price. Therefore, glorify God in your body. This is the only temple He has. It's a great responsibility. But whether we abide faithful or not, still He abideth faithful. And one day, see, He's not taking your will away from you. And if you will have it your way here, still, one day, He'll glorify Himself from that same place. Just as we read here in the book of Ezekiel. What a wonderful truth we learn here about the grace of God and His, how He has to do with us from this story. Now, this matter of this future temple, this one that will be more glorious, the one that will be in Jerusalem, this, of course, is brought into sharp focus when we consider, again, in Zechariah chapter 14. That would be the last chapter in Zechariah. Remember, that's next to the last book in the Old Testament. Remember that Haggai said it would be after the shaking of the nations, and it would be it would be at the time when the desire of all nations would come. Well, here He's coming. Zechariah is prophesying it. In Zechariah 14, behold, the day of the Lord shall come, and thy spoil shall be divided in the midst of thee, and I will gather all nations against Jerusalem to battle. This is the shaking of the nations that Haggai was talking about. And the city shall be taken, and the houses rifled, and the women ravished, and half of the city shall go forth in the captivity, and the residue of the people shall not be cut off from the city. Then shall the Lord go forth and fight against those nations, as when He fought in the day of battle. Verse 4, and His feet shall stand in that day upon the Mount of Olives, which is before Jerusalem, on the east, and the Mount of Olives shall be cleaved in the midst. When He comes to smite the nations by the word of His mouth, and take up His holy place as the King of all this earth, He shall plant His feet on that same Mount of Olives. And then the Shekinah glory will shine from that Mount of Olives, and He'll march Himself into the temple area and enter in through that eastern gate. Well, we'll have more of this when we get to that place in Ezekiel. Here's one other marvelous little truth. You remember the story in the first chapter of Acts? On 40 days after He was resurrected from the dead, He gathered with His disciples, and they saw Him go up in the air. And the 2 angels came and said, Ye men of Galilee, why stand ye gazing? This same Jesus which is taken up from you shall so come in like manner as you have seen Him go. Where were they standing at that time when Jesus left? Where were they standing? Well, if you read the first chapter of Acts, it'll tell you they were standing on the Mount of Olives to the east of the city gates of Jerusalem. Isn't it marvelous? In Zechariah, 500 and some years before He ever came to earth, Zechariah said that He would come back to the same spot from which He left 500 and some years after the prophecy was given. He said He'd come back there 500 years before He ever left from there. Isn't this a marvelous book? How it ties together. Well, these things, what we've been doing tonight is something that's called a chain reference Bible study. In other words, we've been linking together all of these truths about the temple. That's why I keep telling you, if you...
And this was the end of this tape.